Hey folks, tonight we're taking a deep dive into one of the most bizarre corners of life in the Middle Ages, the peculiar things people actually did for kicks. Quick heads up, there were no cell phones, zero streaming services, and definitely no way out. So, how they pass the time? Picture this. Pig races, wrestling for a wheel of cheese, and genuinely believing that breaking wind contests counted as proper entertainment. It was a world where extreme boredom birthed the most outlandish forms of fun. Before you get too comfy, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you really appreciate this unique, soft-spoken storytelling style. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's oddly reassuring to feel connected to everyone else drifting off with us globally. Now, settle in. Let the worries of the day vanish. And together we'll journey back into the quiet nooks of history. The sun crept lazily over the horizon, much like a sluggish yolk spreading its golden warmth across the wet roofs of a town so ancient it had forgotten its own name. Smoke drifted slowly from the bent chimneys, in no particular rush, and the street's muddy ground gave off a squishing noise that made you regret your life choices if you happened to step in it barefoot. Somewhere in the distance, the rooster was absolutely silent. He was awake, mind you, but just not feeling the whole morning fanfare. Maybe he had a sore throat, or perhaps a moment of existential dread. Or maybe, after watching the same resident stumble over the same bucket for 3 years straight, he'd simply decided to go on strike. Whatever the reason, the stillness was quite noticeable, making the sound of the baker's helper tumbling off a stool all the more dramatic. A hefty thud followed by a string of curses he'd certainly deny uttering in front of his mom echoed through the bakehouse as he rubbed his head and blamed the oven for its very existence. The bakery itself still held the warmth from yesterday's fire, the air smelling of sleep, flour dust, and someone forgotten laundry. A lump of dough sat on the counter with stubborn defiance, refusing to rise purely out of spite. The baker, a huge guy with arms like oak branches and a temper like a summer storm, was snoring loudly behind the sacks of grain. Outside, the village stretched awake one stiff joint at a time. A dog scratched behind its ear against a nearby cart. A pig let out a sniffle. A cow named Gertrude, still groggy, meandered into someone's pile of fresh washing. Nobody seemed to notice, or if they did, they decided it wasn't their problem. 2 elderly women sat on a low wall by the well, bundled up in shawls and strong opinions. One of them had already stated that the morning light was too bright, and likely a bad sign. The other was convinced the silent rooster meant someone was either dead, about to die, or that the sun hadn't been wound up properly. Her grasp of theology was fuzzy, but she was certain goats were involved. A young boy with messy hair and a tunic 2 sizes too large tiptoed past the church, carrying a small pail with a single judgmental-looking fish inside. The boy looked guilty. He was supposed to deliver it to the local officer, but he was seriously considering eating the whole thing, scales and all. He passed the local tavern just as a bleary-eyed man staggered out, one boot missing, a live chicken under his arm, and a daisy stuck behind his ear. The chicken looked deeply concerned. Meanwhile, the rooster, whose name no one remembered because they hadn't bothered to name him, stretched a wing, fluffed his feathers, and looked down at the village from the thatched roof of the blacksmith's workshop. He observed the baker's boy burn his finger. He watched a child fall into a muddy puddle and just stay there, convinced that if he waited long enough, someone would bring him a plum. The blacksmith's forge began to sputter to life. The clanging would start soon, bringing the daily symphony of noise and irritation. But not yet. For now, the village was in that quiet in-between moment, too late to be night, too early to be fully active. The vague space of yawns had scratching and forgotten chores. The cattle were puzzled. The hens were having a quiet argument amongst themselves. A goat was chewing on a boot and made unwavering eye contact with someone's grandmother. She didn't flinch. Then came the wagon. Its wooden wheels protested with a loud squeak, pulled by a donkey that appeared utterly exhausted with life. The driver, an old man with 3 teeth and an infectious laugh, bellowed "Good morning" like a battle cry. No one answered, not out of rudeness, but because most had yet to have their first drink or herbal tea and were inherently suspicious of enthusiasm. Finally, with a weary grunt and a flap of wings, the rooster let out a noise best described as a sneeze trapped inside a yawn, followed by an awkward silence and an embarrassed shuffle on the roof tiles. A woman hanging laundry looked up and grumbled, "It's about time," before snapping her bedsheet so hard it could have been a signal flag. And just like that, the village surrendered to the day. Boots were pulled on, aprons tied, bread was shoved into fires, and children were yelled at to stop licking the fence posts. Somewhere, a bell rang. No one knew why, but everyone assumed it had to mean something. The blacksmith began his rhythmic swearing. The priest rehearsed his sermon with a stick and a nearby sheep. The sheep clearly disagreed with his theological points. By the time the sun was fully up, the rooster had returned to sleep. His job, he figured, was done. He'd made a sound. People were moving. The world, as ridiculous and flawed as it was spinning again. And if no one had noticed the precise moment the day began, that was okay. This wasn't a place where things started cleanly. Here, mornings didn't arrive. They shuffled in, lost a boot in the mud, and hoped no one asked too many questions. The first true scent of the day wasn't the bread. It wasn't even the fire. It was a warm, wet sound of old porridge hitting a wooden bowl, mixed with a sharp, unmistakable smell of someone's breath who hadn't, by any stretch of the imagination, encountered a mint leaf recently. In the corner of a crooked little hut, the fireplace gave a low grumble. Flames licked lazily at the damp logs, complaining about the work, while a woman with one skeptical eyebrow and zero patience stirred a pot that looked suspiciously like it had never been properly washed. The porridge inside bubbled with a defiant plop, thick enough to stand a spoon in, yet thin enough to slide out when no one was watching. Her husband, already bare-chested and sweating, sat hunched over a piece of rye bread so dense it could qualify as a medieval projectile weapon. He took a bite and paused mid-chew, not out of pleasure, but out of forensic calculation. Was this the same piece from yesterday, or had it been repurposed from last week's loaf? Either way, it tasted like dirt and grim determination. Next door, a young woman was pouring stale ale into a chipped clay mug for her grandfather, who insisted it was a stomach settler, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The mug itself had a chip shaped exactly like the bishop's nose, a detail the family frequently mentioned but never actually laughed about. Outside, more fireplaces started their morning routine. Wood crackled, metal clanged. Somewhere someone screamed, "Not that again!" and a chicken was gently tossed out a window. The daily rituals had begun. Cleanliness in the village was less a mandate and more a vague suggestion, an idea one might consider if time permitted, which it rarely did. A man stood shirtless by a rainwater barrel, splashing his face with ferocity that suggested he was trying to physically wipe it off. Another used the corner of a tunic, clearly belonging to someone else, to blow his nose. A woman scrubbed her armpits with a handful of moss and mumbled something that sounded like either a prayer or a curse. Maybe both. Dental care was imaginative. Some chewed on sticks. Others rubbed ash on their gums with finger. One daring soul insisted on using sour milk, claiming it kept decay away. It certainly kept conversation away. In one house, a child with wildly tangled hair attempted to smooth it down by licking his palm and then slapping his curls into submission. His mother watched silently, mainly because she was too busy trying to remove a slug from her boot without waking the baby strapped to her back. The bread ovens, at least, were a source of village pride. That is, if your definition of pride included guessing whether today's crust would simply chip your teeth or completely shatter them. The dough was often mixed with whatever ingredients were handy. Oats, barley, the last handful of seeds someone forgot to sow. On a good day, you might find a stray nut. On a bad day, a small stone. At the village edge, a man known only as Crispin was lighting his oven with a sly smile. He claimed his bread rose better when he sang to it. The bread disagreed, but the singing continued. His neighbors didn't complain. They just made sure to loudly praise anyone else's loaf when eating it. Sacred rituals peppered the morning like unwanted crumbs. A few families knelt by their doorways, murmuring blessings with half-closed eyes and fully empty stomachs. The priest's bell rang once, though no one knew why, as he was still asleep in the chapel with candle wax stuck in his hair. One woman tied garlic to her baby's ankle to ward off bad luck. Another spit over her left shoulder after feeding the dog, just in case. A boy rubbed mud on his forehead for strength, then immediately tripped over a bucket and blamed the mud for failing to work quickly enough. There was something both disordered and deeply reassuring about these routines. Everyone had a role to play, even if that role involved scorching the stew, cursing the feline, or waking up with half a beat in their bedding. No one knew how these customs started. They were simply passed down, picked up, misunderstood, misused, and stubbornly repeated. By the time the sun climbed higher, the air was thick with wood smoke, saltiness, and the silent hope that someone, somewhere, possessed a clean spoon. The porridge had started to congeal into something resembling paste. The stale ale was already lukewarm, which was not a compliment, and the bread was cooling on lopsided shelves, daring anyone to express a complaint. Morning had now fully taken hold, not because the rooster declared it so, and not because a clock struck anything. There were no clocks, and the rooster was still grumpy. No, the day began when the silence turned into chatter, when smoke rose from the fireplaces, and when people, despite everything, got on with the business of surviving one tough crust, one cough, and one oddly sacred ritual at a time. They gathered with the precision of a clock, But this was no loud, boisterous meeting with barrels and shouting. No, this was quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous. A semicircle of old ladies established themselves near the well shortly after the dawn, armed with their knit shawls, strong tea, and tongues sharper than the village blades. Their backs were hunched, but their hearing was flawless. Their joints ached, but their memory was impeccable, especially concerning other people's worst mistakes. The well itself was older than any of them. It leaned slightly to the left and creaked when the wind shifted, as if trying to join the conversation. A wooden bucket hung lazily on its worn rope, listening in as if it had ears. Bertha was always the first to arrive, a widow since a modest flood of 21. Not the big one, just a little one that only wrecked a pig shed. She arrived with her oat biscuits wrapped in a cloth napkin, her lips already tightly compressed. Her gossip didn't ease in. It came out hot, fast, and slightly charred. "Did you notice the baker's wife?" she asked the heir. "Wearing yellow. At her age. The nerve." Martha, who was one of the midwife and now served as the village's official skeptic, gave a loud sniff. "Nerve or sheer desperation?" "I heard," interjected Agnes, the smallest and perhaps the most venomous of the trio, "that she's sweet on the cooper, always asking for barrels she clearly doesn't need." The well creaked in what sounded like affirmation, or maybe it just settled a bit. Either way, the mood thickened like stew left on the fire too long. "Barrels she doesn't need," Bertha repeated, tearing off a corner of her oat cake with unnecessary force. "That's exactly what got her sister in trouble, too, always needing things she didn't need." They all nodded. The sort of nod that carried the weight of 4 decades spent silently judging people who moved too quickly, smiled too brightly, or enjoyed anything with too much enthusiasm. A 4th woman, Elsbeth, joined them, limping slightly and dragging a small stool she claimed belonged to her late husband, though it clearly did unless he had been child-sized. Elsbeth only spoke when she absolutely couldn't hold it in, which was rare. She sat, unwrapped a suspiciously dry apple, and announced, "I saw the priest leave the tavern last night with hay in his beard." There was a heavy silence, enough to make the birds pause their singing. "With hay?" Martha finally asked. "And a bruise on his forehead?" The oatcake stopped mid-journey to the mouth. Agnes blinked, as if she'd just received a divine confirmation. "Well," Bertha said slowly, "he did give quite the sermon on temptation last week. Said we must all be tested. Maybe he meant himself. Or maybe he tried to milk Gertrude," Elsbeth added, biting her apple and chewing it like a profound statement. A donkey brayed loudly as it passed behind them, pulling a cart full of nothing. They didn't even look. The donkey was not today's focus. Today, it was the priest, the cooper, the baker's wife, and the woman from 2 houses down who was spotted planting something in her garden after midnight. What kind of herb grows at that hour? Martha asked with a raised eyebrow. "The kind that makes your chickens lay eggs twice as fast," Agnes muttered. "The kind that makes your husband shut up," Bertha added. They all sighed, not wistfully, but strategically. A young girl approached the well, with a bucket too large for her small arms. Her eyes were wide with fear. She greeted them with a quiet murmur and reached for the rope. "Be careful," Bertha warned. That rope frays more every day. And if it snaps, Martha added, you'll end up in a well and hear everything we said twice. The girl nodded too quickly, nearly lost her grip on the crank, and retreated the moment the bucket touched the edge. She spilled half the water down her dress and didn't dare look back. Agnes watched her leave. That one's too quiet. The quiet ones always end up marrying the wrong man. Elsbeth grunted. Quiet ones listen too much. Just like us. There was a rare, brief moment of shared laughter, dry, dusty, the kind that didn't shake shoulders but rustled shawls. They rarely admitted it, but there was a bond beneath the layers of judgment and oat crumbs, a kind of fellowship formed not through affection, but through habit, survival, and the mutual understanding that everyone eventually gave them something to criticize. They quickly moved on to the topic of pigs. The enormous boar near the churchyard had escaped again and managed to eat half of the priest's psalter before someone chased it off with a broom. They debated whether this act made the pig holy or sacrilegious. Elsbeth suggested it was a mix of both and that some men in the village were no different. More oatcakes were passed around, some dipped in tea. Others just gnawed on out of habit. No one asked for recipes. They all knew they were made with the same three components anyway: oats, fire, and mild resentment. By the time the sun was high enough to warm the edge of the stone wall, the women had discussed everything from who was suddenly walking with a limp to who was smiling too frequently. They weren't always correct. They weren't always fair, but they were always unfailingly watching. And tomorrow, they'd be back. Same time, same oatcakes, and a fresh person to talk about. Inside the manor house, where the walls noticeably slumped as if they were tired of keeping secrets, a young scribe sat hunched over a wooden desk that was far too grand for his limited talents. His name was Lionel, though some of the house had nicknamed him Blot, not with affection, but because he had once spilled an entire inkwell onto the bishop's sleeve, and the incident had never been forgotten. At this very moment, Lionel was in his fifth hour of painstakingly copying a legal charter so mind-numbingly boring it could probably stop a war just by being read aloud. It was written in Latin, a language that, for Lionel, triggered a very specific reaction: sneezing. Not figuratively, but literally sneezing. Something about the old parchment, the ink, or maybe the overwhelming sense of duty made his sinuses erupt. He dipped the quill. It dripped. He carefully wiped the excess on a cloth that had once been white, but now looked like it had survived 3 plagues and a minor exorcism. With the solemnity of a devoted monk, he began the next line: ad universa presentibus. Achoo! The sneeze exploded mid-sentence, scattering a galaxy of ink across the document. His nose now sported the distinct mark of a man who had fought and lost a duel with a small squid. Oh, for the love of... He muttered, blotting the page so aggressively the ink spread like wildfire gossip. The steward peered into the room. Progress. Lionel forced a smile, looking like a man on the brink. Good. That charter must be flawless. His lordship intends to have it read aloud at dinner tonight. Lionel's eyes widened. Read aloud? To people? The bishop, the judge, and 3 nobles who understand even less Latin than I do. The steward vanished before Lionel could protest. That was the whole point. No one would understand it. not the bishop, who mostly just nodded and blessed whatever was closest, not the judge, who had once mistaken a baking recipe for a legal subpoena, and certainly not Lord Redgrave himself, who had insisted the document include a special clause about goose ownership rights, just in case. Lionel sighed and started over. Somewhere in the corridor, a serving girl dropped a tray. The crash startled him, causing him to flick his quill like a magic wand, sending a streak of ink across the floor and onto a cat that had been napping far too peacefully under his chair. The cat awoke with a horrified yowl, launched itself onto the desk, and streaked across the page, leaving paw prints like tiny declarations of war. Lionel froze. The cat froze. Both weighed the consequences. "I didn't see a thing," Lionel whispered to the feline. The cat blinked, entirely unimpressed, and stalked out of the room with the attitude of someone who had just unilaterally ended a toxic relationship. He stared at the ruined page, then at the previous four, all of them smudged, blotched, or strangely sticky. One had a deceased fly squashed between two lines, like a macabre punctuation mark. Another had a faint ring where he'd rested his teacup, without thinking. It wasn't that Lionel was incompetent. He was just trapped in a job that clearly didn't appreciate him. He loved poetry. He loved stories. He once tried to sneak a haiku into a land deed just to see if anyone would notice. They hadn't. But now every time the town crier announced that parcel's boundaries, he accidentally recited a quiet meditation on wind and wheat. Still, this charter was supposed to be serious. Apparently, it concerned land boundaries, taxes, and some vaguely threatening clause about cattle. So Lionel tried again. He sat up straight. He wiped the ink from his nose. He dipped the quill cautiously. He breathed through his mouth, hoping to bypass the inevitable sneeze. He wrote, "Ad universe presentibus." "Bless you," came a voice from the hallway, preemptively. He didn't sneeze that time, but he did spill tea on his foot, midway through the section on grain levies. He began to wonder if anyone in the manor actually bothered to read anything. The steward only checked the margins. The Lord looked for his name, and any mention of ducks. The bishop pretended to squint, as if he'd forgotten his reading glasses in heaven. Perhaps, Lionel mused, this wasn't about comprehension. Maybe it was about showmanship, authority conveyed through unnecessarily long sentences, power contained in curly letters, and excessively large wax seals. He paused, wrote a new line, Quibustum terminus umbratis porcus regnantium, which roughly translated to, under certain shady circumstances, the pig rules the silence. He stared at it, smiled to himself, then reluctantly mostly crossed it out. By late afternoon, his desk was surrounded by a graveyard of crumpled parchment, a half-eaten oat biscuit, and a mouse that appeared to be reading over his shoulder. His nose was inked again. His eyes were strained. But the charter was finished. Mostly. Lionel wiped his hands on his tunic, stood up, and immediately knocked over the inkwell one final time. He considered letting out a primal scream. Instead, he whispered, "I will blame the cat." He then rolled up the document, tied it with string, and left the room with the stride of a man who had lost a single battle but would survive the war. The charter would be read that night, mispronounced, misunderstood, and forgotten by morning. But somewhere deep in its dense clauses, a small smudge shaped like a paw print will remain, proof that at least two beings had cared enough to completely ruin it. The sun was barely up, the mist still lingering in the fields like unwelcome gossip, when Edwin was handed a bucket, a cleaning rag, and a mission that would scar him for seasons to come. Go milk Gertrude, the stable master had instructed, wiping his hands on his apron as if bestowing a sacred honor. She's in a mood today. Be gentle. Gertrude was always in a mood. Sometimes that mood was lazy contempt. Other times it was full-scale war. She was the only cow in the village with her own nickname among the children, the Throne of Doom. Her gaze was rumored to make grown men rethink their entire careers. Still, Edwin nodded like an idiot and accepted the task, mainly because refusing would have meant scrubbing the outhouses instead. At 16, he was an apprentice in everything and a master of nothing. He had once managed a trip over his own foot while standing perfectly still. Today, he was about to learn the art of milking a cow. He approached the barn with the reverence of a man heading into combat. Birds chirped above, oblivious. The rooster finally crowed, as if to announce, "This is going to be good." Inside, Gertrude stood like a statue carved from pure indignation and straw. She did not look at Edwin. She looked through him. Her eyes narrowed. Her tail flicked ominously. "Good morning," Edwin said softly, trying to sound brave. "I'm here to, the milking." Gertrude did not reply. She shifted her weight slightly, which could mean either come closer or prepare for termination. It was difficult to tell. He placed a bucket carefully beneath her, knelt on the stool that wobbled dangerously if you breathed too hard, and reached out with shaky hands. He'd been told the proper technique. Thumb and index finger first, then the rest of the fingers, like gently squeezing a pouch of mead. But the teats felt like warm, twitchy balloons, and simply touching them made him flinch. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Gertrude. Gertrude immediately sneezed directly into his face. Edwin wiped his eyes and tried again. He gave one slow, cautious tug. Nothing. Another tug. Still nothing. He looked up, and Gertrude was slowly chewing, staring at it with a smirk that should not have been possible on a bovine face. "Please," he pleaded. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, or maybe it was just a baker's cart. Either way, it felt personal. He decided to try the other side. He moved the stool and settled back in. The scent of hay and old cow was strong, almost comforting in a strange way, but still utterly intimidating. He reached for another teat. "Okay, this time we're going to be best friends," he announced to the cow. She snorted. He pulled. A tiny squirt hit the side of the bucket. A sound of triumph, a flicker of hope. "Yes!" He squeezed again. More milk. He was succeeding. Then Gertrude lifted one massive hoof. It wasn't a subtle warning. It was a loud declaration. He froze, hands mid-squeeze. He didn't move, didn't dare breathe. The hoof came down, not with crushing force, not quickly, but with absolute precision. It landed squarely on the toe of his boot, pushed the stool completely out from under him, and sent him sprawling into the dust, the bucket flying. He lay there, surprised, not physically hurt, but profoundly humiliated. Gertrude looked satisfied. She blinked once, slow and deliberate, and returned to chewing her cud. Edwin sat up, rubbing his aching toe, and noticed the stool had landed on its side like a fallen crown. He retrieved it, dusted it off, and returned to the stool with the resolute look of a martyr and the posture of a drowned rat. "Okay," he muttered again. This time, he tried humming, a soft, nervous tune that sounded like a cross between a lullaby and a funeral march. He gave a gentler pull, eyes closed, hoping that perhaps Gertrude was a cow who appreciated music. To his surprise, she remained perfectly still. A thin stream of milk began to trickle steadily into the bucket. He didn't breathe, didn't blink. He just milked, slow and methodical, with the entire focus of the 16 years concentrated into those 4 fingers. He finished the first teat, then the second, the third, and finally the 4th. The bucket was half full. He stood up slowly, deliberately, refusing to tempt fate. He offered a small, formal bow to Gertrude. "Thank you." She didn't move. He backed away, clutching the bucket tightly, and made it to the barn entrance. He didn't run. That would have been too obvious. He walked quickly, calmly, until he reached the stable master. "Here it is." The stable master glanced into bucket, then at Edwin's dust-covered face. "Is that all? Gertrude must be ill." "I don't know," Edwin said, avoiding eye contact. "She seemed fine to me." He looked back at the barn. Gertrude was still standing there, unmoving, silently judging. Edwin went to scrub the outhouses. It was the only part of his day that was starting to feel predictable. It was a glorious day for a conflict. Not the clatter of metal and the screams of soldiers, but the quiet, slow, utterly satisfying war waged by children against an empty, overgrown field. It started with Thomas, small, quick, with eyes that saw a strategic advantage in every pebble. He declared a pile of soaking wet leaves to be an enemy fortress. Pip, who was stocky and lacked imagination, immediately called him a liar and demanded they construct a proper fort instead. Marigold, the oldest and quietest, began silently collecting sturdy sticks, serving as the group's silent engineer. The war was officially on. The field itself was ideal. Tall grass, a thick patch of stinging nettles, and a large, strangely shaped mud puddle they immediately christened the Sea of Sorrows. Weapons were created on the fly. Sticks became heavy swords. Dried cow droppings were designated as landmines, and one particularly hard turnip was an anti-personnel grenade. Thomas led the initial charge, screaming a war cry that sounded suspiciously like a distressed barn cat. He slipped immediately in the Sea of Sorrows and emerged utterly transformed, covered head to toe in black, glistening mud. The others stopped and stared. Pip was consumed by envy. Marigold was deeply intrigued. The nature of the war had shifted. It was no longer about the leaves. It was now entirely about the mud. The field erupted in spectacular anarchy. They threw handfuls of mud. They rolled in it. They wrestled in it until all 3 were indistinguishable from the very earth beneath them. The initial screaming stopped, replaced by breathless panting and gasping laughter, a state of perfect, sticky, joyful chaos. They fought for the sheer, pointless fun of it. The goal was not ultimate victory, but total immersion. Thomas attempted a flying body slam and missed completely, landing face first in a patch of wild sorrel. He tasted dirt and victory. Marigold, who had painstakingly constructed an elaborate stick fence, watched as it was immediately flattened by a mud-coated Pip, who claimed it was too fancy. They argued passionately over the strategic importance of the nettle patch. They argued over what to name the largest mountain of mud they created. Suggestions included Sir Floppy, Mud King, and Dirt Messiah. No decision was ever finalized. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the field where the children lay sprawled like fallen soldiers, clutching their aching sides and laughing uncontrollably. They were stained with grass, dust, and several substances best left unidentified. Their hands were blistered, their hair full of burrs, and their faces shone with profound satisfaction of a truly excellent, pointless fight. A bell rang faintly from the village center, the signal for the noon meal. There was a collective moan, not because they weren't hungry, but because the war was just reaching its climax. Still, they rose, brushing off soil and honor, and made their slow trek back through the tall grass. Thomas walked with a limp he certainly hadn't had 10 minutes earlier. Marigold carried a single weed in her hand, more symbolic than useful. Pip clutched the turnip lump like a championship trophy. Gertrude the cow watched them pass with deep, bovine disapproval. Back in the field, the mud puddles still glimmered, quiet, patiently waiting for the next conflict. Lunch was a chaotic, necessary intermission. It wasn't a formal meal. It was a desperate scramble, a quick refuel before the afternoon's labor or mischief. What they ate was less a choice and more a matter of immediate availability. In the bakehouse, the little bread left over from the morning was hard, crusty, and faintly warm if you tucked it under your armpit long enough. The baker's helper gnawed on a slice while pretending to sweep the floor. It tasted like flour, smoke, and quiet apology. Out in the pasture, 3 young boys were having a loud argument over the last scoop of stew in a worn wooden bowl. The stew was gray, suspiciously gray. No one could quite remember what ingredients had gone into it, but one swore it was turnip. Another insisted it was beetroot. The third simply muttered, "Bones," and refused to elaborate. They decided the only fair way to resolve the dispute was a race to the nearest oak tree and back. The winner choked it down while the losers watched in a mix of pure envy and mild concern. By the village well, an elderly woman unwrapped a cloth to reveal a hunk of cheese so aged it had developed a distinct personality. It smelled of feet and sheer defiance. She cut it with a knife that had seen better centuries, popped a piece into her mouth, and declared it tangy, which was a generous description. In the manner, lunch was different, but not necessarily superior. It was louder, more pretentious, and involved far too much wine. The lord devoured a suspiciously plump chicken, while the cook muttered muffled curses from the kitchen. Lionel, the young scribe, ate a small slice of pork pie that he strongly suspected contained cat meat, but wisely decided not to ask. His immediate digestion was not his main concern. Survival was. Out in the village, the food preparation was more improvised. A boy named Lyle carried a squirrel he swore he'd found already dead. His plan to roast it was promptly interrupted by his mother, who confiscated it and buried it under the herb garden, muttering dark things about hexes. He settled for a clump of sorrel and an apple he dropped twice. Near the church steps, two young girls took turns licking honey off a twig. They claimed they had found it near the beekeeper's fence and it had just fallen off. It hadn't, but they were fast. The beekeeper was old, and the honey now belonged to fate. They giggled between licks, dipping their fingers into the jar they hadn't stolen, only temporarily adopted. An apprentice blacksmith, covered in soot and pride, munched on a roasted onion as if it were a prize. No bread, no salt, just the onion. His breath created a 6-foot radius clearing around him, which he preferred. He called it his warrior seasoning. By the edge of the woods, an old hermit cooked something mysterious in a pot over a low fire. No one knew what it was. He never told anyone. Sometimes he ate it. Sometimes he just stared into the pot. Lunch was less about satisfying hunger and more about maintaining tradition. The wandering priest stopped to eat a handful of roasted barley from a leather pouch on his belt. It tasted like burnt earth, but he didn't complain. Another traveler gnawed on the heel of bread he'd been saving since the last town. He offered a bite to his mule, who politely declined. The children, who had nothing, played a game with a walnut shell and 2 pebbles, pretending it was a royal feast. One mimed drinking soup. Another declared her pebble was too spicy. They all agreed it was the best lunch they had never eaten. Eventually, stomachs quieted. Crumbs settled into cracks. Lips were wiped on sleeves. The afternoon began with a deep, collective groan of return to labor. It was a time of low-angled sun, long shadows, and the constant awareness that time was moving, but not nearly fast enough. In the vineyard, the workers remained hunched over, plucking grapes that stubbornly resisted being picked, arguing with the sun that refused to set. The foreman, a tiny man with an enormous voice and an intense fear of yellow jackets, barked instructions that no one could hear over the constant buzz of the insects. The tavern owner swept the floor with a broom that mostly just rearranged the dirt and complained softly about the high price of beer and the low quality of his clientele. His wife, who was smarter and undeniably tougher, spent the afternoon patching a hole in the roof, fully aware that she was a true manager of the household, even if no one else openly acknowledged it. The blacksmith hammered away rhythmically, the sound heavy and reassuring. It was the village's background music, the steady beat of ongoing work, the sound of a life being built, one hot, heavy strike at a time. The priest, having recovered from his hay and beard fiasco, spent the afternoon praying with a visible urgency that suggested he deeply offended a higher power. He rang the church bell twice, once by pure accident, and once to make the first ring seem intentional. Everyone ignored him. In the manor, Lionel the scribe was assigned the task of tidying the Lord's library. It was less a library and more a haphazard collection of dusty scrolls, old hunting trophies, and several jars of dubious pickled eggs. He alphabetized the scrolls by color, which seemed as practical as any other system, and managed to avoid sneezing for a full 60 minutes. The air was thick with dust, old memories, and the smell of dead ambition. He discovered an ancient book of poetry, opened it, and was instantly captivated by a verse about a dancing badger. The steward walked in. "Still working, Lionel?" "Yes, sir." "Good. That Badger poem needs to be filed under P for pointless. We don't read poetry here." Lionel sighed and moved the book. Out in the pasture, the cows stood motionless, chewing slowly, seemingly contemplating the profound nature of existence. Gertrude, the queen of the herd, watched the sun begin its slow descent and waited for a new apprentice to come and hum to her. She was a creature of habit, and she expected the evening milking to be just as humiliating for the poor boy as the morning one had been. The evening brought with it a change of pace. The lights softened, turning the harsh, angular edges of the village into something gentle and almost nostalgic. Fires began to glow again. The scent of stew, sometimes recognizable, sometimes not, wafted through the cool air. The final chores were completed with a quiet urgency. Doors were bolted. Animals were safely penned. The last vestiges of natural light were used for mending clothes, whittling wood, or simply staring into the mesmerizing hearth fire. The tavern, however, was just starting its shift. The benches were already filling up with the men, and the women would join later, either to drink or simply to supervise the men making fools of themselves. The priest, after a long day of exaggerated piety, walked into the tavern, looked around at the patrons, who immediately became intensely interested in their own boots, and offered a smile. It was the smile of a man who just remembered his fly was down, and there was nothing he could do about it now. "Good evening," he said, his voice echoing slightly more than intended. "Tonight's brief reading is about the virtue of trust." He held up the Bible like a protective shield. No one could see the page. He wasn't even sure it was right side up. "There are moments," he began, "when we are convinced we are prepared properly. We've done everything we were supposed to do, and yet we suddenly find ourselves standing barefoot in the Lord's house." A long pause, a deep breath, and a knowing glance down at his mismatched shoes. A few men coughed nervously. A woman nervously giggled. The priest continued, "Trust is the certainty that even if you manage to spill an entire flagon of ale all over the main altar, God still loves you." Probably. It was a bizarre sermon, full of non sequiturs and overly specific examples. No one truly understood the theology, but they enjoyed the tone. It sounded suspiciously like a heartfelt apology. They drank their mead, which tasted like fermented optimism, and they listened, or at least pretended to. Night in the village was a complicated affair. It was a time of deep-seated fear, superstition, and worries about ghosts and goblins and things that went bump in the darkness. But it was also a time of comforting warmth, firelight, and human closeness. The elderly women gathered in one small cottage, trading stories of witches and ancient curses, while the children huddled together on the floor, pretending not to be completely terrified. The young couple snuck out into the darkened fields, hoping the shadows were thick enough to conceal their shame. The priest eventually finished his sermon, drank one more tankard, and left, shouting a loud blessing at a passing goat. The goat did not look impressed. In the small monastery on the nearby hill, Brother Thomas was sitting quietly by his window, whittling a piece of wood. He was the monastery's resident oddball, a man who concluded that the shortest path to God was through silent, repetitive manual labor. He never spoke, communicating only through his meticulously carved wooden figures. A sheep for penance, a fish for silence, a particularly elaborate carving of a man with his pants around his ankles for the sin of lust. The other monks found him disconcerting, yet they also found his small figure surprisingly soothing. They left him in the chapel, in their simple cells, and in the kitchen. In fact, a few of the younger monks started joining him, though clumsily and always without speaking. Was he crazy? Perhaps. Was he enlightened? Possibly more so than any of them. But most agreed he was something else entirely. A living question mark the monastery had been fortunate enough to receive without requiring an answer. So he whittled, he wandered, he whispered to the trees, and the trees, if you listened very closely, if you truly paid attention, sometimes whispered back. Down by the river's edge, where the reeds swayed like nosy old neighbors and the water moved slowly enough to hold secrets, the women gathered with their laundry baskets and their mouths already halfway open. The sun was still stretching its morning light over the hills, but the gossip had already started brewing. Laundry day was never primarily about the laundry. It was about the comforting rhythm of scrubbing and talking, about forcefully beating stains out of tunics, while effortlessly demolishing reputations. The soap was made of lye and animal fat, rough as gravel and just as unforgiving. The clothes got clean, of course, but what truly sparkled was the conversation. The older women arrived first, wrinkled hands, sharp eyes, and tongues that could cut like the winter ice on the river. They claimed to know everything, or at least they acted like it. A baby born with 2 teeth, a husband who smelled suspiciously of catfish, and not just fishing, a cow that produced sour milk for 3 straight days. They exchanged tales not for accuracy, but for sheer theatrical drama, for the pure joy of tearing apart the dull daily life of the village. The younger women listened intently, sometimes contributing a small detail, sometimes just trying to absorb whatever secrets they might overhear today. Down the line, a girl named Bryn accidentally dropped a heavy tunic into the river. She shrieked and sprinted after it, splashing wildly, only to be met with shouts and applause from the rest of the group. When she returned, dripping and defeated, an older woman handed her a drying cloth and said, "That tunic floated better than your chances with the butcher's boy." Laughter. It wasn't all mean-spirited. There was a genuine warmth in the teasing, a kind of tough love wrapped in sarcasm. They picked at each other like scavenging birds. But if anyone outside the group tried it, they would fiercely defend one another with their fists and their bars of harsh soap. Midway along the bank, 2 sisters, Ida and Rhoda, worked side by side, elbowing each other as they scrubbed. Ida was quiet, which made her a prime target. "You and Will, the miller's apprentice," Rhoda said, looking straight ahead, her voice casual, "were walking awful close last market day." Ida didn't reply, just wrung out a tunic, with more force than was necessary. "You were smiling." Ida still said nothing, but her cheeks turned as red as raw meat. Rhoda, satisfied, moved on to scrubbing her own husband's shirt, attacking a grease stain with a violence that suggested she was scrubbing the man himself. The conversation drifted into territory too dark for daylight. They confessed small misdeeds, things they would never tell the priest, Things that were only funny in the exclusive company of women with soapy hands and share hardships. I hid my husband's boots so he couldn't go to the pub. Laughter. Didn't work, did it? No. He just went barefoot. Another offered. My mother-in-law is a genuine witch. She smells like sour milk and makes too many comments about my weight. I kissed my cousin once, another confessed. And then, but it was dark, and I didn't know until the morning. I put stinging nettles in my mother-in-law's bedding. Gasps, cackles. I think my husband is dreaming about that barmaid. You think? Mime moans her name in his sleep. They howl with laughter. One woman laughed so hard she dropped her live bucket into the river and had to wade in after it, muttering prayers that were only half serious. The sun climbed higher. The air dried the clothes. The sins were confessed. The reputations were thoroughly ruined. The women gathered up their clean laundry and their dirtier secrets and started to walk back toward the village. They moved together, a strong, chattering mass, protected by their mutual knowledge in their soap-chapped hands. The men in the village saw them approaching and suddenly found urgent work to do, instantly aware of their own questionable histories. Laundry day was over. The village was safe again, until next week. The May Day dance was the year's focal point, a time when the strict, muddy routine of village life momentarily dissolved into riotous chaos, vibrant color, and plenty of bad decisions. It was held on the village green, a patch of land so uneven it should have been officially declared a liability. But tonight it was transformed. Ribbons were woven into the flowering hawthorn tree. Ale flowed freely from large barrels. A fiddler and a piper, both slightly tipsy and mostly in tune, played music that managed to be both exhilarating and deeply melancholy. The young men and women, normally segregated by the harsh demands of work, were suddenly permitted to touch, to smile, and pretend they had a future beyond their parents' humble shack. The air was thick with the scent of wild onions, nervous perspiration, and desperate, youthful hope. The dancing was awkward. It was less a structured set of steps and more a collective, dizzying shuffle, where the main objective was to avoid crushing a foot and maybe, just maybe, accidentally touching a hand. The young men drank too much and stumbled to the reels with the grace of falling trees. The young women giggled behind their hands, careful to appear simultaneously modest and completely available. The older villagers watched from the perimeter, offering a running commentary that was both accurate and merciless. Look at Thomas. He dances like a goose with a limp. The officer's daughter is too quick. She's going to break a hip. The fiddler is playing a funeral dirge, but they haven't figured it out yet. The night wore on. The ale barrels began to empty. The music accelerated. Inhibitions melted away like spring snow. Hands were held. Secrets were urgently whispered. Two young men got into a passionate, half-hearted brawl over a piece of potato and were immediately separated by the blacksmith, who used one hand for each and effortlessly lifted them like kittens. At least two proposals were made under the hawthorn tree, both of them instantly regretted. The air was charged with potential, with the threat of disaster, and of the profound, loud joy of being alive for one single glorious night. Lionel, the young scribe, was there, having been grudgingly dragged along by the steward. He stood near the mead barrels, attempting to appear scholarly and failing miserably. He watched the girl fall down, jump up, and immediately start dancing again, a look of fierce, pure joy on her face. He composed a poem in his head about her resilience, titled The Mud Angel, and realized he was thoroughly unsuited for this kind of life. A girl approached him. She was quiet, with kind eyes. "Aren't you dancing?" she asked. He mumbled something about his boots being too prestigious for the dance floor. She laughed, a soft, pleasant sound. "I read your goose ownership clause in the charter." It was honestly the only part one understood. Lionel smiled genuinely. For the first time all evening, they didn't dance. They simply talked quietly by the hawthorn tree, about books, about the stars, and about the relative speeds of different types of clouds. It was the quietest moment of the entire night, and perhaps the most meaningful. Elsewhere, the local officer was attempting to dance with the baker's wife, a spectacle that was both hilarious and slightly horrifying. The baker watched, uncertain whether he should be outraged or simply thankful for free entertainment. The baker's wife eventually managed to escape, stumbling back to the dance circle with a visible sigh of relief. By the time the moon was high, casting the green in silver and shadow, the dancing slowed to a collective weary sway. The music was soft, a long, drawn-out song about a farmer who lost his pants. At least 2 proposals were officially accepted. One was sealed with a promise to try not to be so annoying next year. The other was sealed with a pinky swear and a spit handshake. But not everyone left glowing. Lena waited an hour under the hawthorn tree, clutching a note in her sleeve. He never showed. She burned the note using a flint and walked home barefoot, wiping her eyes as if they were just adjusting to the moonlight. Garrett proposed to the wrong girl by mistake. In the dark, cloaks all look remarkably similar. She accepted anyway. It was a night of passion, of human mistakes, and of the profound, simple happiness of feeling truly alive. They stumbled back to their homes, smelling of smoke, damp earth, and potential regret. But they had danced, and that, in the medieval village, was more than enough. Margaret the goose was not a bird to be taken lightly. She was a creature of high intellect, minimal patience, and a deep-seated contempt for all forms of human authority. The village priest, Father Michael, was her main target. This was because Margaret's primary residence was a churchyard, and Father Michael had once accidentally stepped on one of her eggs, an act she never, ever forgave. Every Sunday, just as the congregation settled in for a long, dull sermon, Margaret would materialize. She would stand at the church doorway, crane her neck, and emit a hiss that sounded exactly like a kettle screaming with pure fury. She would then waddle down the center aisle with the purposeful gait of a visiting dignitary, and attempt to bite the kneecap of anyone who dared to move. The Sunday service was less about the holy word and more about the collective, tense effort to contain Margaret. The children were terrified. The women openly giggled behind their hands. The men held their breath, waiting for the inevitable chaos. Today's sermon was on the topic of humility. The priest began, his voice noticeably shaky, acutely aware of the hissing at the door. We must all learn to be small in the face of the divine. Hiss! The priest visibly flinched. The local officer, a large man who considered himself the village's unofficial goose control specialist, crept towards the door with a piece of hard, stale bread. Margaret ignored the offering. She waddled directly past him, her eyes locked on the priest. She reached the altar and stood directly in front of the Father, her posture suggesting a formal challenge. The priest cleared his throat. As I was saying humility, Margaret let out a piercing honk, followed by a theatrical plume of droppings deposited right onto the altar stone. There was a loud gasp from the congregation. The baker's wife stifled a loud shriek. The priest turned a painful shade of red. "Margaret, for the love of God, stop." The chase was on. The priest hurled his sermon notes at her. The officer lunged with his stale bread. Margaret, light as a feather, easily dodged them both. She darted up the aisle, evading the blacksmith's wife, who tried to corner her with her shawl. Margaret escaped. The children cheered loudly. The baker's wife tried the same thing. Her shawl was ripped. Margaret escaped again. Eventually, it was the youngest choir boy, small, quiet, and usually ignored, who simply crouched down and held out a small piece of his own crusty bread. Margaret approached slowly, suspiciously, then carefully took the bread. He gently scooped her up, his arms full of feathers in pure triumph, and held her like a priceless relic. The congregation burst into applause. The priest tried to restore order. "Ahem, let us return to our prayers," he said, adjusting his robes with forced dignity. Margaret was carried out with great ceremony, as if she were a celebrated saint being respectfully exiled. Evening prayers resumed, but they were noticeably shakier than before. Every few minutes, someone would stifle a burst of laughter. The blacksmith's wife wiped tears from her eyes. The officer swore he'd seen a sign. The priest pretended not to notice the single feather still floating gently near the altar. After the final amen, people filed out quietly, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, except for the children. They clustered near the steps, whispering excitedly. They had a new hero, a new legend, and a brand new reason to look forward to church. The evenings were reserved for the sharing of stories. After the last of the day's duties were complete, after the stew pot was thoroughly scraped clean, and after the children were finally asleep, or at least pretending well, the villagers would gather near the communal fire. The nights were long, cold, and profoundly dark, and the best way to keep the darkness at bay was a collective, spoken light. As the night settled its cold grasp on the thatched roofs, the villagers began to gather, not by formal invitation, never that formal, but by a deep-seated instinct, as if the crackling hearth sent out a silent, magnetic summons to all souls within earshot. One by one, they slipped inside the great hall adjacent to the tavern, where the fire burned steadily and the wooden benches were just soft enough to tolerate for an hour or two. The flames danced against the soot-darkened stone, casting shadows on the walls that morphed from terrifying giants to harmless chickens in a blink. The room smelled of smoke, damp wool, old onions, and the faintest hint of mead. A pot of weak ale was passed around, the ladle wiping itself clean on the nearest tunic. The conversation began slowly, a low murmur of quiet gossip and minor complaints. Then someone would start a story. It was usually old man Hemlock, a man whose memory was as long as his beard was gray, and who claimed to have once witnessed a troll steal a baby, a claim that was technically true, though he refused to give further details. He started with the tale of the three-legged dog that could accurately predict the weather. Then someone else chimed in with the story of a traveling salesman who sold teeth. Another added a tale of a cow that inexplicably gave only wine. They weren't always factual. They weren't even always good, but they were shared. They built upon each other's memories and elaborate exaggerations. I heard that salesman's teeth were human. Someone else added that the wine cow only produced wine after being fed a specific, psychedelic mushroom. The stories grew, twisted, and became entirely new things. Someone told the tale of the local officer's wife who chased a tax collector so aggressively that it dislodged one of his teeth and changed the outcome of a local election. Someone else added a bit about a woman who insisted she could hear bees buzzing inside her bread, which turned out to be true, and the bread had to be ritually exorcised. I once saw a duck walk into the tavern, quack 3 times, and walk right back out. Was it a real duck? Define real. The stories blended into one another like cheap watercolors left in the rain. It was impossible to separate the plain truth from the joke or the memory from the blatant invention. And that was the entire point. Stories weren't for historical records. They were for warmth, for diversion, for stretching a simple evening into something that felt longer, richer, and less ordinary. Eventually, the yawns came in slow, heavy waves. Boots scraped against the floor. Cloaks were pulled tighter around shoulders. One by one, the villagers stood, murmured their good nights, and slipped back out into the cool night. Only the fire remained awake, burning low and glowing, whispering to the last few embers about goats, about ghosts, and about the strange things people choose to believe when the stars are out and the shared meal is over. Tomorrow, there will be fences to repair, cows to milk, and pies to inevitably burn. But for tonight, the darkness had been held back, one shared story at a time. Sleep descended upon the village like a heavy, shared quilt. It carried the scent of wood smoke, old worn leather, and the faint, earthy aroma of the damp ground. The loud noises of the day, the relentless hammering, the shouts, the bells, were replaced by a low, collective drone of human unconsciousness. The most noticeable sound was a snore, a deep, resonating declaration of sleep, the kind of sound that suggested the sleeper was engaged in a furious wrestling match with his own throat and was currently winning decisively. It began in the blacksmith's humble cottage, always him. Then, as if in response, another snore erupted 3 houses down, slightly higher in pitch, like a duet no one had requested. A dog whimpered softly in its dream. A baby coughed once, then wisely decided against waking up. The wind tapped lightly on a loose window shutter. Somewhere a voice muttered, "Roll over, you old mule," and received a loud grunt in reply, followed by a loud, wet-sounding expulsion of gas. That, too, was a nightly part of the symphony. Flatulence was not met with shame in this village. It was considered a mark of health, of robust vigor, and occasionally of nighttime dominance. The baker's wife had once proudly claimed her husband broke wind so forcefully it actually scared the rats out of the grain store. Whether or not that was true, the rats were gone, and the baker was immensely proud. Tonight, the gas was particularly sociable. A rhythmic series echoed from the officer's cottage, followed by muffled laughter. He and his wife had turned into a game, a nightly competitive event. The village was also a vibrant stage for the tiny, nightly dramas of the vermin. Mice scurried excitedly in the rafters. Fleas jumped with Olympic ambition. The cat, utterly exhausted from its daytime battles, twitched in its sleep, dreaming of sweet revenge. Sleep was less about finding peace and more about a temporary ceasefire. The communal house, where the traveling men and bachelors slept, was especially noisy. One man snored like a rusty, malfunctioning saw. Another was convinced, even while unconscious, that someone was attempting to steal his pants and would occasionally flail and shout, "My britches," before being urgently shushed by his bunkmate. The apothecary claimed to have created a flea-repelling balm made of garlic, mint, and pure, hopeless optimism. It worked for exactly one single night. Then the fleas returned with what felt like a large tactical deployment. Dreams stirred, strange and elusive. The blacksmith dreamed of a tap-dancing cow that judged his work severely. A young girl imagined her chicken could talk and accused her of theft. The officer, ever noble even in slumber, muttered official-sounding things about property lines and cabbage laws. He would deny all of it when morning arrived. In the manor house, the steward snored so rhythmically it was mistaken for drum practice. The housemaid dreamt of a feast where all the spoons grew legs and ran away just before the soup was served. In one quiet cottage, a widow dreamed of her husband, not exactly as he was, but as she wished he had been. He didn't snore in the dream. He smelled of fresh rosemary and knew exactly how to dance. Down in the communal house, the last fire sputtered in the hearth. One man sat bolt upright in his sleep, eyes fluttering, muttering anxiously about taxes and pants. His bunkmate nudged him gently, and he sank back down, a defeated sigh escaping his lips. This was life. Loud, itchy, slightly embarrassing, and tomorrow would arrive soon with its roosters, its burnt breakfast, and someone pretending they hadn't talked in their sleep about marrying a goat. But for now, the entire village breathed, huffed, snored, and shuffled under the patchwork quilt of night. And in the thick darkness, a single flea paused, wiped its tiny face, and got back to its relentless work. The fire was now completely out in most of the houses. Only a thin ribbon of smoke drifted from a few chimneys, curling up into the star-packed sky like a final weary sigh. The village had quieted, not utterly silent, never that, but deeply hushed, as the earth itself had pulled up a heavy woolen blanket and settled in for the night. But there was always one last small task. Tomlin pulled on his heavy boots by feel, not sight. They were still damp from the stream, and one had a tiny bit of straw lodged inside. But he didn't complain. He was accustomed to it. He lifted the lantern with a grunt, its light dim but reassuringly warm, and stepped out into the crisp, cool breath of the night. His wife mumbled something from the bed, probably "don't forget the lock," or maybe just "radish." He didn't pause to ask. The barn was pitch dark, immense, and full of quietly sleeping animals. It smelled of sweet hay, sharp manure, damp wood, and that distinctive, unexplainable scent only animals seem to produce. "All right," Tomlin whispered to himself. "Just one quick look." He walked past the chickens first. Most were huddled together in sleepy clumps, dreaming of worms and poultry dominance. One lifted its head, blinked at him with reptilian disapproval, and tucked itself back into feathered sleep. The goat pen came next. The twin goats, Mumble and Crick, were tangled together in a configuration that defied both logic and basic physics. One of them was chewing something in its sleep. Tomlin wisely decided not to ask what it was. Then came the main event, Gertrude. She was the largest animal in the village, possibly the oldest, and certainly the most temperamental. She held strong opinions about everything, and was never shy about expressing them. If the world wasn't her liking, she would let you know with a well-aimed kick, a loud bellow, or a strategically placed spray of urine. Tonight, she was completely still. She lay heavily in the straw, one massive, dark shape in the deep gloom. He held the lantern up, the light catching the faint sheen of her eye. She looked directly at him. He held her gaze. He reached out and gently placed a callous hand on her flank. The stable master had once told him that a final, kind touch somehow made the milk taste sweeter. He didn't know if that was true, but it made him feel better. He felt the slow, deep, regular rhythm of her breathing. A soft, warm, massive creature, holding the entire silent barn in her stillness. A small mouse darted past his boot, carrying a crumb of bread, probably the same one that had been raiding the grain sack all week. Tomlin didn't care tonight. Let the little thing have its crumb. He stood up, his bones creaking louder than the barn door hinges. "Good night, Gertrude," he whispered. She did not reply. Outside, the stars were still patiently watching. Thousands of them were scattered across the sky like forgotten seeds. Some bright, some faint, all utterly ancient. He paused and looked up just for a moment. No specific prayers, no deep thoughts, just a quick glance, just enough to feel small in the right, comforting way. Back inside, the village was deep in its dreams. The baker rolled over and muttered darkly about scorched crusts. The priest mumbled an unfinished sermon. A child somewhere whispered, "Dragon," and then immediately snored like one. Even the dogs were still, their tails twitching at phantom memories of rabbits that had gotten away. Tomlin slipped back into his house, careful not to let the door squeal. He set the lantern down, pulled off his boots, and slid beneath the thick blanket beside his wife, who mumbled softly and curled into his warmth. The night was silent now, deep, profound, and finally completely still. And for a little while, everyone was safe.